called Accessible Media Inc. from Canada. Before we get started on my talk, I just want to talk a little bit about the organization in general so you can get a feel for what we're all about. Accessible Media Inc. is a not-for-profit media organization. We operate 3 broadcast services. One's called AMI Audio, the other is AMI TV, and we have a French-only channel called AMI Tele, which serves our Quebecois neighbors. The goal of our organization is to make accessible media for all Canadians, and we do that in a variety of different ways, and I'll touch on that in a little bit. The broadcast channels are designated as must-carry services in Canada, and this is a regulatory thing that ensures that people, specifically from the blind and partial vision, partially sighted audiences, have access to our service. We also operate 2 websites. One is ami.ca and amitele.ca, where you can find a lot of AMI's original content, and it's all available on demand. Before I get going, we're talking about IDV here, and all of our content that we do, all of our original stuff is done using IDV. So I encourage anybody who's interested in following up on this topic to go and have a look to see what that's all about. Okay, so before we can really cover what integrated described video is, we need to talk a little bit about what described video is. Described video, as we deem it in Canada, is also known as audio description in the US and abroad. And DV is a narrative that explains, key visual elements of a program, such as costumes, settings, and body language. Anything that's important to a narrative of a story that may not be apparent to someone who's blind or partially sighted. This is added to a fully packaged, complete program via a secondary audio track, which leverages natural breaks in the dialogue and soundtrack. And this can either be open or closed, which means very much like captioning, that it's either on, always on, which is open, or closed, which means it can be controlled by the user. So let's talk a little bit about the characteristics of described video. As I mentioned, DV leverages a secondary audio track. It uses short bursts of concise narration, if done correctly, inserted into strategic gaps in the soundtrack. This is a very important aspect of DV, because if you have narration clobber your natural soundtrack, that essentially destroys the quality of the description and basically leaves you with a terrible experience for your end user. And then all of this is added to a fully packaged program. And what I mean by that is, a lot of people describe this as a post-production function, when really it's not. Post-production means that after you've done your shooting, you take it into the editing rooms, and you add your voiceover and whatnot. This is after all that's done. DV should not be done until the program is 100% complete. And this makes a lot of sense in terms of, you don't want to add DV to a program that's not done. That means you're going to have to go back and do it afterwards. So how do we implement DV, technically speaking? From a broadcast standpoint, DV is leveraged using what's called the secondary audio program, or SAP. For web, there's many ways that you can do this, and I'm just talking about a couple here, more to illustrate the point that it's a little more complex on the web than it is on broadcast. For the web, we use a source tag as a possible option, or a video tag declaration, and a combination of a video tag and an audio tag in a SMILE file. And a SMILE file, just for people that may not know, is a synchronized multimedia integration language file. It's an XML-based language that allows for synchronization of various forms of media. And this is important because other forms of DV that are implemented via the web, and a perfect example of this is Terrell Thompson's Able Player, which is a great product. from my understanding, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but it serves a secondary video file with a DV track burned on top of it as an option, whereas a Smile file actually overlays and synchronizes an audio file over top of it, which is a little bit different in the way that it's done, and more analogous to what you would see from a broadcasting standpoint, where the files are married using a playout system from the broadcasting level. So, just to kind of show, how it's a little difficult to accomplish DV in the web format, I'm just showing some code here of a Smile file implementation where you can see, where a video tag is shown within a PAR tag, and then there's some subsequent audio tags. And this sample that I've taken is pulled directly from the NCAM website. So, once again, I just wanted to illustrate the fact that this is not always the easiest way to accomplish things. It's certainly, DV is something that's traditionally a lot easier to roll out via a broadcast format. Now, at this point of the presentation, I would normally have video to show you. However, due to some of the limitations of the way we're doing this, I can't do that. But I just want to kind of explain what we're trying to accomplish here. If you go to the IDV24 hashtag, I have added a couple of links to YouTube files, the first of which is a DV example clip called Show Me Your Art. And what we tried to do, and this was specifically done to illustrate the concept of IDV, we wanted to create a baseline for a like-for-like comparison. And some of the things to note here, as mentioned in the description, description is meaningful visual items narrated through a secondary audio source. And in this case, the on-screen talent are not responsible for sharing anything with the audience other than their lines in their script. The actual description is delivered via a secondary voice that is really not part of the production. And in this particular case, when the show is created, there's an assumption that people can see what's happening on the screen, which is not always the case. So while DV is a great source of accommodation, there are various criticisms. One of the criticisms is the secondary audio track itself. It's not always appreciated in mixed viewing audiences where you have blind viewers and sighted viewers. Sighted viewers find DV generally obtrusive and kind of jarring. And I can explain what happens, down in a little bit. But sorry, pardon me. Also, the amount of description required is a very personal thing and can vary among users. And this is also a problem because, if you talk to a lot of people that use audio description, some of them get by with a little bit of description. Some people like, a smattering of description. Other people like a lot of description. So it's really challenging to find the proper mix of description, for this kind of process. There's also some technical challenges, which I kind of touched on before, both from the integrator standpoint and from the consumer. Traditionally speaking, trying to turn on the DV track via SAP is a barrier to access because it has to be flipped on using a set-top box, and the interfaces from those are traditionally very inaccessible. So it's very challenging for someone who is blind to actually navigate this and actually turn the description on and off. So that's one of the reasons why at AMI, all of our programming is done via open description, so they don't have to go through that process in order to do that. They know that when they come to our channel, they're going to get everything with description, and it makes the process a lot easier. So DV is accessible but it's not necessarily inclusive. So, and I'm going to show you what I mean by pulling a user testimonial from some of our research. At AMI, we're always looking to validate what we're doing. We have a research panel that pulls from about 1,200 people from the blind and partially sighted community. And I'm going to show this quote to illustrate the difference between accessibility and inclusion. Oftentimes, I don't want to burden my family with having to watch TV with the description on, so I wait until later to watch by myself. So this basically exemplifies some of the challenges with traditional DV, and more importantly, the difference between an accessible experience versus an inclusive one. Watching TV with your family is a very social activity. And in a lot of cases, because the DV is a bit obtrusive to a sighted viewer, a lot of times people isolate themselves and go watch as opposed to consuming programming, as a family unit, which is not, it's a pretty profound statement when you think about it. So this is going to bring us to a discussion about accommodation versus inclusion. The Michener Institute defines accommodation as something that can level the playing field for people by altering environmental factors that may present barriers to success. So basically what that means is accommodation can provide access, but it doesn't always promote inclusion, as the quote illustrated. And inclusion itself seeks to provide a singular experience consumable by the widest audience possible. And in the Accessibility is Dead talk, Johan kind of illustrated that. And I think the basic point of what he was saying was that, we need to stop thinking about these concepts as separate entities and consider the entirety of your audience and leave your assumptions at the door. So this brings us to universal design. And in order to achieve inclusion, we lean on philosophies like universal design. And in short, universal design principles revolve around the design of products and services that meet the needs of people to the greatest extent possible without the need for adaptation or specialized design. So generally speaking, people don't want to be served a different experience than anyone else. They want to be able to participate in the same way as the rest of society. And this basically speaks to the social model of disability. Now, integrated described video is the universal design approach to described video. And we do this through integrating the description during the production with hosts and guests and whatnot, describing the key visual elements themselves as they go. And this is beneficial in numerous ways, but specifically, this eliminates the need for that second audio track, which which causes a lot of problems from technical and consumption levels. And as I mentioned before, we use IDV for all of our original content at AMI. So once again, at this point, I would show you a clip that exemplifies the same scenario provided in the DV sample, but now using an IDV sample. So spoiler alerts aside, it's important to know that the role of the narrator illustrated in the clip with the DV has now actually shifted to the on-screen talent itself, because the DV track is no longer required. And then there's no assumption of what can be seen on screen. And the easiest way to compare this is to think back to a time before TV, when radio was the predominant way of bringing entertainment into the household. Radio programs were very much like TV shows of today, except they were completely aware of the fact that the audience could not see them. So scripts required vivid descriptions along with use of sound effects to paint a picture for the viewer. Now, the visual nature of TV has kind of pulled us away from that form of storytelling. And IDV uses the same type of philosophy to create inclusive programming. So normally at this point, I would ask that, you kind of compare and contrast the two samples and kind of reflect on the differences here. what I would ask is that everyone interested, go back and watch these videos. Like I said, I've added them on Twitter, and I'm really would be excited to get your feedback on this, especially for our friends who use traditional description when consuming video. I'd like you to ask yourself if you felt that the story was effectively presented to you using this kind of technique. Did you find that it was natural? And did you feel like something that was missing without the DV track? This is a pretty different experience for someone who is used to consuming this kind of programming using, described video. And a lot of it has to do with establishing trust with the viewer. So at first, without the use of that secondary audio track, they're not necessarily sure if they're getting everything that they expect. But what we're seeing is that, once you get past this, which is very shortly after you begin watching the program, it becomes pretty natural. So as I mentioned earlier, we try to validate what we do against our target audience to make sure we're on track. We want to understand the effectiveness of IDV, something we really believe in. So we conducted a series of studies. And basically what we did was we wanted to determine the efficacy of both DV and IDV separately. And then we could compare and contrast. So this is going to be some stats, so it might be a little bit dry, but it shows kind of how our audience experienced IDV. So the first metric was enjoyable viewing experience, and the DV by itself achieved a score of 69% from a viewing experience perspective. IDV, on the other hand, achieved an 82% enjoyment experience. The next metric was it easy to follow? And DV, 72% of our audience felt it was easy to follow traditional DV broadcasts, whereas IDV, we had an 81% effectiveness rate. So basically what this is telling you is that IDV ranked higher than traditional DV in terms of the overall enjoyment of the program, as well as the quality of the description. Just a few more stats. And this one's extremely important and speaks to the nature of inclusivity. Can sighted friends and family enjoy this program with me? 54% of the DV community said they could, while IDV showed an 85% effectiveness in this area. And then the last metric was preferred form of description. IDV was 60%, DV was 30%, and there was a 10% no preference. The interesting thing to note, the DV rate seems actually quite high. And one of the things that we noticed, kind of what I mentioned earlier, is that people weren't sure exactly how to take it without like I said, they were used to the paradigm of the second audio track. That's what they trust. And, they had a bit of a hard time just from this one clip, establishing that trust level. So, over time, we're finding that, once you get used to the new paradigm, it actually becomes natural, as I mentioned. So it's clear through the research that I shared that the IDV concepts resonate with our audience and they appreciate the fact that it's more inclusive. But I'm going to share some more testimonials from, anecdotes from the research. So the first one is, it wasn't overly described. It was just right. It didn't annoy me, and I got all that I needed from the description they gave. The second quote is, I like that it's more natural flowing rather than having a voiceover. I would be watching the same thing everyone was watching, and we'd all follow along. And lastly, The details that I would have missed are included in the description. The description did not interfere with the program. So, so overall, as you can see, this is a relatively new concept, but IDV has been incredibly well received, and the positives definitely outweigh the negatives. Now, that being said, we are still always looking to improve this. So once again, comments and suggestions are always welcome. We're constantly analyzing this. We have a team of DV specialists who do traditional DV and IDV, and we're always finding edge cases in terms of how we apply these technologies. And sometimes we run into some difficulties, so we're always looking at ways of improving the standards to work with these kind of edge cases. Okay, so let's see. So as I mentioned, it's a new concept. One of the things that is discussed when we talk about IDV is what kind of programs lend themselves well to this genre of description. And this is an interesting concept, even at AMI. Originally, it was kind of thought that IDV would be kind of limited to very specific types of programming. And if you watch the clip, you can kind of see what I mean. I, however, have a different take on it, where I believe very much like if you think about how radio production was done back in the day and the kind of the breadth of programming that they used to host, it was dramas, comedies, you name it. To me, you're only limited by the style of writing and your creativity. So I believe that even though we haven't figured out how to apply IDV to all different kinds of programming as of yet, I feel that the potential is definitely there. So we asked the question now, what's next for IDV? So we have a Describe Video Best Practices group, which is comprised of AMI staff and members of the Canadian broadcast industry. And we have developed a series of best practice guides. We have one for traditional description. We have one for live DV. We also have one that was recently developed for IDV. And like I said, through working with the Canadian Association of Broadcasters, it was very important to get their involvement. These are people that are responsible for putting broadcast content into the broadcast ecosystem in Canada. So through this collaboration, we were able to create this best practice guide for IDV with their support. And that is extremely important because our regulatory body called the CRTC regulates the amount of description that is required for every broadcaster. Now, we are very unique in the fact, as I mentioned, we require 100% of our content to be broadcasted. So they had always made an exception for us for IDV, given the nature of our programming. But recently, we were actually given written approval from the CRTC for all broadcasters to start using IDV as a valid form of description. So that means that when they do their productions, if they produce any content using this IDV methodology, the CRTC will acknowledge it as description against their description metrics. So that's a huge thing for us. Also, and I'm probably not supposed to share this, but I'm going to anyways, because I'm pretty proud of it. We were awarded an FCC Chairman's Award for our IDV Best Practices Guide. We were told about it last week. They're just kind of late in doing the announcement, but we're picking up the award on Tuesday. So I think it's fair to share the news. So this is also a huge accomplishment, not just for us, but for this methodology, because this is something now that we feel that we can share with our counterparts in the US and even abroad. We're going to be speaking at a audio description conference in England in the fall, and I will be talking about IDV there. So we're really excited to share this concept with the world. We're hoping to keep the momentum going. And it's also not just for broadcast, in my opinion. There's a huge amount of opportunity in the digital space. You think about all the videos that are on YouTube. YouTube's one of the biggest distributors of digital content on the planet. And a lot of times, for people that are, blind and partially sighted, you can't always enjoy that content the way you'd like to. Captioning has become ubiquitous, but audio description and described video are nowhere near that. We spoke at a conference in November. Google had their first accessibility summit. They're obviously putting a lot of efforts into the accessibility movement, which is tremendous. So we went to talk about IDV. We also went to advocate for the inclusion of a described video mechanism, very much like they have for captioning. But obviously, there's inherent challenges with doing that. And the audience we were presenting to was largely made up of YouTube content creators who were from the disability community. So what I wanted to let them know was like, listen, while you're waiting for Google to implement this, whether they do or not, it's still I'm still unsure at this point. While you're waiting for this technological innovation, the concept of IDV is there for you to use, and it's in a lot of cases, definitely depending on the complexity of your video, it just requires a simple shift in mindset to make a video that's inaccessible accessible. Think about, for example, an unboxing video for a piece of tech. You get your brand new iPhone and you unbox it. There's a million videos like that out there. And a lot of times the assumption is that people are seeing exactly what you're doing on screen, but we all know that that's not the case. So by talking through what you're doing and explaining it, you could turn something that was completely unwatchable by a certain segment of your audience and make it completely accessible. And this is the beauty of something like integrated described video. And it can be used in many forms of media. Another avenue where I think this has a lot of promise is in academia. When I was at CSUN, I met a gentleman who was the team lead for accessibility at Berkeley, and I'm sure we're all aware of kind of the shenanigans that happened with Berkeley recently, right, when they pulled a lot of their online content. But while we were talking, he mentioned the fact that they were served notice by the Department of Justice, and for the first time ever inside the notice, they actually talked about audio description. And that was that's a pretty new requirement from the Department of Justice. So generally speaking, that would mean that if you do a lecture and let's say you videotape that lecture, you then have to ship it off to somebody who has skill in audio description to add that post-production layer and then send it back. And there's a lot of money associated with that. But not only that, the people in the classroom at the time who have the most need for that, they're probably not getting the best in-class experience. So what IDV does and the concepts therein, by training your professors and your faculty on how to create, how to embrace that simple shift in mindset, you could then take a lecture that may be inaccessible and would then require that secondary treatment afterwards and turn it into one that's accessible out of the box. Now, part of the issue there, I understand, would be that the Department of Justice and the FCC and whatnot would need to recognize something like IDV as a valid form of description. But that's something that we're hoping to work with. So, so as I mentioned, there's a tremendous amount of opportunity here, and in bare bones terms, it's a very simple idea, which, depending on the sophistication of the production you're working with, how you implement it will be affected by that. So for example, I talked about an unboxing video. Can be very simple. That can be achieved by one person. For an organization like us, when we do a television series using IDV, we usually take the production staff of if let's say we outsource this, we take the production staff that we have outsourced to, and we train them on IDV concepts. We show them what it is. We get them excited about it. And then we also have an IDV specialist on set, just ensuring that they're on the right path and they get the opportunity to be in the director's ear a little bit and help them make decisions in terms of script and execution that allow IDV to come through. And it's extremely important to do that because we talked about trust. And when you have an audience who starts going down and appreciating the IDV methodology, well, let's say, for example, you might miss something that's key in the production. The natural assumption would be to go back and say, oh, I'll just add this as a traditional DV piece afterwards. But the second you do that, people then question what they've missed before. So when you work with IDV, you have to stay with IDV. You cannot mix IDV methodology with traditional description. Otherwise, you really run the risk of violating the trust of the user. And it's extremely important that they feel comfortable knowing the fact that you have given them everything that they think that they need. So, okay. So let's see. Okay. So in summary, IDV is an innovative approach to making media accessible to the blind and partially sighted community. It's a more universally inclusive option. A little more to that point, it's a very natural way of doing programming. The fact that you don't have that secondary audio channel makes it feel like any program that you would watch at any given time, with the benefit of having the widest possible audience consume it. And then lastly, it's technically less complicated. And this point cannot be undersold. Instead of having, multiple files that you have to deliver and figure out how to, make it work on a broadcast or via the web, which has all its inherent challenges, you have one single file that you can present to the world, whether that's through your television channel, whether that's through your website, whether that's through anything. And, it's an incredible time saver, and it basically means that you're simplifying your process, which also means a significant cost savings at the end of the day. So I mentioned we have a bunch of best practice guides. Please take these. We have put a tremendous amount of time into these guides. We would love people to use them, implement this stuff, talk to us about it. I have put the links in the YouTube, in my presentation, and I'm just going to read them out for everyone's benefit. They're bit.ly files, so it's going to be bit.ly/2SM3 capital MDQ for our post-production described video best practices guide. For our integrated described video IDV best practices guide, it's going to be bit.ly/2SMHZAE. And we also have an integrated described video IDV white paper, which talks a little bit more about what IDV is. So please have a look at that if you have any more questions. And that is at bit.ly/2T2XKOM. Once again, these are free resources to use at your leisure. And, we are constantly reviewing them. We're always looking for ways to improve upon these processes and these best practices. So even if you do download these, please check back often, because we want to keep these things as fresh and relevant as possible. And lastly, keep in touch. We really thrive on feedback. It's really important to us to understand the needs of the community at large. And we're really truly interested in making programming that is accessible to everybody. So please follow us. Please share your comments, good or bad. You can get in touch with us on Twitter at Accessible Media. That's one word. My Twitter handle is at A11YCOB. On Facebook, you can contact us on Accessible Media Inc., all one word, and on YouTube at Accessible Media, all one word. Thank you very much, guys.
Great. Thanks a lot, Chris. That was awesome. And congratulations on the FCC award for the... I thought you were going to bring it. You could show us the award, your trophy. So who gets to take that home?
Well, I mean, I'm accepting the award, but this is the work of a bunch of people. So, and lastly, the person formerly in my role, Robert Pearson, was the one who established the DV Best Practices group, and a lot of the credit goes to him. He unfortunately passed away a year and a half ago, but this is a good this is a tribute to him and his work as well in this area. So
that's awesome.
Yeah,
that's awesome. So I don't believe Sarah had her eyes on Twitter for questions. I don't believe we had any from the Twitters, but okay. I believe Sarah has a question for you.
Sure. I have a whole lot of them.
Perfect.
Actually, yeah. So this has been really helpful. One thing that I'm wondering about, oftentimes we're in a position of making a case for doing accessibility, and people are concerned about costs. And I wonder if you have any sense of the accommodation costs versus the inclusive design costs, so that there would be a way to make a return on investment case for moving away from accommodation and moving toward inclusive design.
To be honest, it would be a challenging thing without understanding the specific use cases, because as I mentioned, depending on the sophistication of the project you're trying to, you're trying to bring forward, there's a lot of variables in there. For us to do IDV on a big production, it is a lot of work, and we have staff that are very dedicated to doing that. If you're doing something smaller, it may not be so onerous. So I really couldn't say, I couldn't give you a specific cost. We'd have to look at it from an individual basis.
Sarah, sorry, Chris, I was just going to ask if you could share your camera with us so we could see you, because right now we're just staring into a black void, which is totally cool, but a bit ominous. So
yes.
And you're a nice guy, so yeah, I think maybe you're still on your last slide or something. I'm not sure. You stopped sharing your screen?
Okay, perfect. Sorry.
Yeah, there you are.
That's better.
Hey.
It's still pretty dark in there, though.
Yeah, well, my light, I have an automatic light, so it went off on me halfway through, unfortunately. I couldn't get up to turn it back. I apologize for that.
That's okay.
Did you have any more questions though?
I do actually, yeah. So you made a really good point about instructional contexts where organizations are doing videos and putting them online and not having video described video. And do you have any sort of best practices, tips and tricks for training people like presenters and teachers how to embed description into their talks and presentations?
So we don't as of yet, but I can tell you that we are working on producing a set of videos that kind of cover how to use IDV in a bunch of different ways. So, from a broadcast perspective, how to create a video for YouTube. One of the use cases could be if you're doing a presentation or, training faculty and whatnot. So those videos should be ready to go in September.
Mm-hmm.
So once we have those, we will share those with the world as well. So, but as of yet, we do not. And once again, this is really my feeling on it. I haven't really made any specific plans to push IDV in this manner, but it's something that I feel that is really a strong possibility, and it lends itself very well to this type of scenario. So.
Yeah, I can see a lot of potential in it as well. And we've done screencasts and things like that for accessibility training and tried to use those methods. And I guess I'm wondering if it seems a little bit like an art and science in the sense of being able to describe as you go. And I just wondered if you had any sort of tips and tricks, or is it something to practice in front of the mirror?
Well, I'll give you an example. I mean, it very much is an art and a science, and it's also very much up to the interpretation of the professional bringing the description. So the example that my DV team gives us all the time. So imagine, and this could be for description or IDV, but they generally speaking give it for description. So imagine you're watching a movie and you're trying to write the script for your post-production DV script. And the first scene you see, it's just, you see a couple of people standing there, there's a table, and then there's a spoon on the table. Well, normally you wouldn't describe the spoon because it's in the background. But as you go through, at the end of the show, you realize that that's the murder weapon in a thing. So now you have to go back and you have to make reference to the fact that this was now there. So it really depends on the situation. And a lot of the times there's no real way to make this easy for people. They just have to know what it is they're trying to achieve from a storytelling perspective. And a lot of times that will help illustrate what needs to be described. And a lot of it's experience.
Yeah.
And even still, like, we have describers here that have been doing this for 10 years, and they still have issues that they grapple with. And we all sit down and we throw ideas around and figure out ways to, what the best approach is.
Do you see, sort of from a production standpoint in the video production team, certain ways that we could integrate this into practice so that people who have different roles to play in making sure that the description is integrated know what they need to do and when they need to do it and how to do it?
Yeah. So once again, the IDV best practices.
Okay.
They outline a lot of this stuff. So
Great.
it's a pretty comprehensive document, and I suggest you have a look. And if you have any questions following that, happy to help.
Excellent.
Get you the answers. So.
Great. That's the extent of my questions. Let me just double check on the old Twitters. And I think that November makes a point about that there's a lack of qualified describers, and it's expensive to do post-production. And are there tips and tricks for ways to plan better pre-production to make sure that those qualified people are available and it's a little bit less expensive and time consuming?
Well, so the pre-production kind of idea is very much where IDV kind of lives. I wouldn't say just pre-production because it's one of those things that it's done throughout the production, but IDV, if you're talking pre-production, lives very much in the script. So if and this is one point that I didn't make before. You can't always use IDV. So, for example, if you buy, so let's say you buy CSI, right? And it doesn't have description. Well, you're not going to be able to go back and do IDV because it's already completed. But if you're completing your own production, then that generally means you have access to the script. You can go through the script. And a lot of the times what they do is, and it seems very simplistic, but it's a great starting point. Our guys will go through and they'll try to determine where there might be gaps in terms, and they kind of storyboard the script out, and then from there they make their determinations as to what elements need to be described and then the best ways to do that. So in some cases that's done using voiceover. So sometimes you'll see a show and the person will be talking and then you hear them speaking in voiceover. They're just talking about, hey, well, we did such and such and such. And sometimes it's done that way. A lot of the times you can actually just leverage the natural sounds that occur in the background, to do that. And that's extremely important. And it's very important to not supersede those because the sounds very much tell the story themselves. So once again, there's no real easy way to do this. Do you know what I mean? It takes some time, it takes some experience, but with the guide and with some practice, starting off on some smaller projects and working your way up from there, I think it's an effective way to get started.
Great, thank you.
That's great. So, sorry, I think we got about 14 minutes until the next talk. So, yeah, Chris, that was awesome. Thank you very much, and it was great having you on. And now you can go have a nap.
Anyways, I just want to thank you guys at the Paciello for A, including me, and B, for putting on another great event. You guys are pretty amazing. So,
well, thanks very much. And yeah, it's an honor to have you with us. And yeah, we look forward to seeing you next year.
All right, guys. Thanks a lot.
Cheers. All right.
Thank you.
All the best.
Bye-bye.
All right, everyone. So we'll be back in about 13 minutes for the hour 22. And hang in there. We're almost there. All right. So go take a break and we'll see you on the hour. Cheers.